Kabbalah, first of all, is something that a lot of people have imagination. Their imagination runs wild when it comes to Kabbalah. To try to figure out what is Kabbalah. There is the popular Kabbalah. There are Kabbalah experts. There are celebrities who practice Kabbalah, but that's not real Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an authentic part of the Torah, and I will give you a little hint of something that we're going to see soon inside. And that is that the Torah is referred to as an orchard, a paradise, a pardes. And by the way, pardes is the origin of the English word paradise, because paradise in our mind is an orchard that has a lot of fruit trees, flowers, and it has a lot of plants, and it's a pleasant place where we want to be. It's called a gan. It's a garden. But the word pardes actually has 4 letters. And each of the 4 letters indicates another level of Torah study. So the first, we have done this in the previous JLI. So the first letter is the pei, which goes for pshat, which is the straightforward meaning. Second one is reish, which is remez, which is the hints and numerology that's in it. And then you have the daled, which is drash, which is the midrash, which we discussed in the second class. And then we have sod. Sod is the secret, the mystical. So you'll see up on the screen that it says Kabbalah and Sod. The reason that it says Kabbalah and Sod is because really it's the same thing, but there are 2 ways of referring to Kabbalah. Why is Kabbalah called Kabbalah? Because the literal translation of the word Kabbalah means that which is received. We find that the Torah in general was received and then it was transmitted. The Mishnah in Tractate of Ethics of Our Fathers begins with the words, Moshe kibel Torah. Moshe received the Torah. He received the Torah at Sinai, but then he transmitted it. Part of the transmission was in writing. Part of the transmission was oral. But even after everything was written, there was one part of Torah, which was the mystical part of Torah, that was only transmitted orally and was never written down until the later generations. The other name for Kabbalah is Sod. Sod is spelled Samach Vav Daled, which means a secret. Sod is the secret. It's the mystical secret aspect of Torah. So Kabbalah's teachings are received secrets transmitted through the generations. Now, I also want to make a disclaimer. There are many books out on Kabbalah there. I do not recommend that you read any of them because most of them are basic interpretations of self-proclaimed Kabbalah scholars. Kabbalah cannot be taught on one's own and has to be taught with a teacher. Today, we also have Hasidus, Chabad Hasidus, which actually takes Kabbalah and brings it out in a level that we can understand, even though, as we will see, that's not the main theme of Hasidus. Now, let's talk about this Kabbalah in a sense. The Talmud actually says in the Tractate of Chagiga that it was prohibited to teach Kabbalah even to the star students. And the Mishnah says that when it comes to the story of creation, you're supposed to teach it to a select group of students so that they shouldn't misinterpret the story of creation. But when it comes to Maaseh Merkava, in other words, the actions of the chariot, the vision of Ezekiel, which is the basis of Kabbalah, that you shouldn't even teach in private. In other words, that could only be taught to 1 in a generation, 2 in a generation, 3 in a generation, and you don't see much of it written. However, the Rambam feels that it's necessary to mention it, and he says that actually does appear in the Talmud. So it was always sort of whispered in private to a disciple that the teacher knew was worthy of receiving the information and could keep the information classified. And not only that, understand what the information means. That's why Kabbalah was not revealed until later years when they started writing Kabbalah in various countries, as we're soon going to see in the video. So I'm going to like to ask you to make sure your books are open. Please look inside on page 235, and we're going to start with text 1. This is Rambam writing to his student and guide to the perplexed. And he's asking why Kabbalah is not more prevalent and revealed to the masses. So the Rambam writes, as you're well aware, even the Talmud, which was received by tradition, was not originally committed to writing in a book that was disseminated to the people, which we learned actually in class number 3, if you remember. Now, if care was to be taken to avoid writing the oral Torah in a book accessible to all because of the disadvantages in such a system, certainly then no portion of the esoteric teachings of Torah could be written which could divulge these teachings to everyone. Why was the oral Torah transmitted and not written? Because there was some people that might actually extrapolate and misuse the oral Torah in the wrong way. So therefore, they didn't want to disseminate it in writing. It was only given from teacher to student. But then when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi realized that it's going to be lost to the masses, so therefore he started writing it. But Kabbalah is even more secretive, as we're soon going to see. Rather, these teachings were only communicated by a few uniquely qualified individuals to other uniquely qualified individuals. As I earlier explained, saying, and quoting that part of Talmud that I mentioned before in Chagiga, the secrets of the Torah can only be entrusted to skilled sages. Nothing but a few remarks and allusions to these teachings are to be found in the Talmud and the Midrashim. They are like small kernels enveloped in many husks, so that the reader is generally occupied with the husk without thinking that it encloses a kernel. And this, by the way, sums up the problem of reading any kind of Kabbalah book. Most people that read Kabbalah books or write Kabbalah books are more focused on the husk than what's inside. To quote Churchill, who was a master of his words, he said, it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And that's probably what Kabbalah is. So what we can come to the conclusion is that Kabbalah is a hidden wisdom. It's written in code. It's conveyed in code. It's written in an esoteric terminology. And we're soon going to have a chance to read a piece of Kabbalah in one of the original books. And we're going to read it in English, and we're going to see if anyone can decipher it and see what does it really mean. Why the secrecy? So let's mention that Kabbalah, again, is the most misunderstood part of Torah. And if one is not prepared to study Kabbalah, it could be very dangerous. I want to say that it is, somebody once asked a question about nuclear energy. And I know nuclear energy has a very bad rap. The reality is that nuclear energy is the cleanest energy, the most efficient energy, only if it's used properly. And then it could be endless amount of energy to keep us going for centuries. However, if it's misused or if it's not watched carefully, it can be devastating, as we saw in Chernobyl with the nuclear disaster. Kabbalah is actually the same way. Kabbalah can enlighten you in the greatness of God, unlike anything else, and it actually is the theology of Judaism. It opens up our minds and hearts to see something that is so deep that we couldn't see without it. However, if it's not used properly, it could be devastating. One example that the Gemara in Chagiga gives in the Mishnah, let's give a look in text 2. It's a very powerful text. It's a very famous one. It says, Arba nichnas lepepardes, 4 sages entered the orchard. Remember, we mentioned the orchard, but they entered into the 4th level of the orchard. Who are they? Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, some names you'll recognize from the Mishnah, from the Haggadah. Acher, Acher means the other one. Actually, his real name was Elisha ben Avuya. He became a heretic, so the sages refer to him as the other one. And Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai looked and died. He looked into the orchard and he died. Ben Zoma looked and went mad. Acher, cut down the planting. In other words, he became a heretic. Rabbi Akiva entered in wholeness and peace and emerged in wholeness and peace. Let's talk about this for a second. When it says, Ben Azai looked and died, it wasn't died as a punishment. He achieved something which is called the ecstatic essence of his soul yearning to connect with his maker. So the soul no longer wanted to remain in the body. So it left the body and bonded with Hashem. What left was that he died. Then you have that was Ben Azai. Ben Zoma The information was so overwhelming that he went crazy. I'm going to give you a physical example, but it's not nothing near a spiritual example. Times Square. So I don't know how many of you have ever visited Times Square in New York, but if you look at Times Square, there's all these billboards and electronic messages that are coming at you. Imagine if you have the ability not to understand, but to grasp, to see all the messages at once. What would it do to you? It would be so overwhelming that it would burst and fry some of the circuits. That's what happened to Ben Azai. I'm sorry, to Ben Zoma. There was so much divine information there that it just fried his circuits and he went crazy. Acher said, this is too much. I can't do any of it. And he just removed himself from the scene. Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and emerged in peace. Why did Rabbi Akiva enter in peace and emerge in peace? Let me explain. The three others went in with the intent to see, what can I gain from entering? I'm so curious, I might grow from it. So I want to grow in my Judaism. I want to grow in my relationship to God. How can I become a better person? So they went in, but it was all for selfish reasons. So therefore, it was overwhelming for them. Rabbi Akiva didn't go in for a selfish reason. Rabbi Akiva said, perhaps God wants me to be there because I can do something for God, which I couldn't do otherwise. Remember Rabbi Akiva, when he was put to death, he was smiling as his skin was being flayed. And his students asked him, how can you smile when you're going through such torture? And he said, all my life, I said, when will I come to observe this mitzvah of Mesiras Nefesh, of sacrificing my life to God? And now that I have it, shouldn't I smile? Rabbi Akiva was the opposite of someone that was doing it for his own right, for his ego. He did it only for the sake of God. So since he didn't go in with a selfish reason, he went in with a selfless reason, he came out whole. But what do we learn from here? We learn from here that the esoteric secrets of the Torah, which are in the Kabbalah, are so powerful that if they're misused, they can cause a tremendous damage to the human being. The truth is they can also cause a lot of damage to the universe. If I was to ask you a question, and this is to everybody, including those that are listening in by Zoom, what is the most powerful weapon in the world? An idea. An idea. As you see it up on the screen. Very good. Knowledge, ideas are very powerful. Everything else is just a tool that you use for your ideas. If you have an idea to change the world and make it a better place, and you come up with the plan, then it's amazing. If God forbid somebody comes up with a plan to destroy the world, like we saw in World War II, it could be devastating. Kabbalah is not just ideas. Kabbalah is so powerful that it deals with the very foundation of the universe, of what God put into the world. And if it's misunderstood, they could become totally distorted. And for that reason, the sages have actually concealed this from history because it's immensely powerful. So text number 4. The Baal Shem Tov says on the year Rosh Hashanah in the year 5507, which corresponded to 1746, my soul ascended to the higher worlds. I rose level after level until I reached the chamber of Mashiach. I asked Mashiach, when will the master come? He answered, by this you will know. When your teachings will become known and revealed throughout the world, and your well springs will spread to the outside. In Hebrew, it's Yafutzu ma'inatecha chutza. In fact, this statement, Emasai Kasimar, Sheyafutzu ma'inatecha chutza, is a very popular Chabad song that used to be sung by the Rebbe's Farbrengen. So the ideas that the Baal Shem Tov was teaching and bringing out actually is a prelude to coming a Mashiach, because when Mashiach comes, what does it say in the Rambam? The Rambam says, Lo nis'avo hachachamim, that the wise sages of Israel did not desire the coming of Mashiach because of all the good things that Mashiach will bring, like peace and tranquility. Of course they wanted that, but that wasn't the main focus. The main focus was the wisdom of the divine that'll be revealed at that time, which wasn't revealed until then. What will be revealed? The esoteric part of Torah. So for that reason, there needs to be the preparation for that. Now, here's one more thing, and then we're going to go into the sample. We mentioned before that there's the Orchard of Torah. The Orchard of Torah is 4 letters. Pshat, Remesh, Drus, Sod. Now, we say that this corresponds to 4 levels of the soul. There's the Nefesh, which is the simplest part of the soul. That refers to the simplest interpretation of Torah. Then there's the spirit, the Ruach, which that is the Remez. And then you have the Neshama, which that's the Midrash. Then you have the Chaya. The Chaya is the part of the soul that is so infinite that it can actually not be contained within the soul. And that represents Kabbalah. But there is a 5th dimension, which is the quintessential of Torah and the quintessential of the soul. And that is called Yechida. It is also referred to the inner soul. Hasidus is the inner soul of all genres of Torah. I remember as a young man before my bar mitzvah, it was in 1965, for the Yutas Kislev, the 19th of Kislev Farbrengen. It was one of those famous Farbrengens that were very, very long. It started at 8:30 at night and finished at 5:30 in the morning. And there was a lot of singing and joy, but the Rebbe also expounded on the depths of Torah. And the Rebbe spoke about Talmud, the Rebbe spoke about Hasidus and gave a Hasidic discourse. And then he gave 3 consecutive talks where he explained this concept that Hasidus is the inner soul of the Torah. And he gave actual examples in Torah learning. And it took hours and hours. Eventually, that was published as a book. And it's called the Inner Dimension, or it's called the Kuntras and Yana Sholteres Hasidus. What is the aspect of Torah Hasidus? But we don't have the time now to go into that, so we will use one sample a little later. But what are we going to do now? What we're going to do now is we're going to examine a little piece of Kabbalah and see what it means and how does it relate to us and how can we come to understand it. Okay. Now, why is it before we go there, see where we are. Okay. Why is it that it was written in code? It was written in code in order not to allow even people that understand Hebrew or Aramaic to be able to try to decipher it and figure it out and come with the wrong interpretation. So it's written like a code, like a riddle in an enigma, just like we said before. So if you look at text 5, page 248, this is a very famous piece of the Zohar. And it's quoted in a lot of discourses of Hasidic literature, which is explained, and we'll have a little bit of an explanation after we finish, but let's look first at what it says. This is written in Aramaic, but we're going to read the English translation. At the beginning of the manifestation of the king's will, the lamp of darkness engraved engravings in the supernal purity. It emanated from the most concealed of all concealed things, from the secret of endlessness. A formless vapor was inserted into a circle that was neither white nor black nor red nor green nor any color at all. When he began its measurements, he created bright colors to shine forth. From within the center of the lamp, a fountain spouted, from which the colors down below were painted. Can anyone take a jab at it to try to understand what this means? Yeah.
It seems like it's saying that if you want to connect with God in the sense, you need to block out the physical world.
But that's not what it says here. It's true, but that's not what it says here. He's describing an event. He's describing creation. But how is he describing creation? I have a little secret for you that students of Chabad Hasidus, when they study this is like the ABCs. They understand it very well because they've learned it so many times and it was transmitted to them. So it's not such a code. But like any code that you have, once you know the tools of how to decipher the code, it's no longer a code. So what we're going to try to do is decipher the code a little bit and do what they do in studying a Chabad discourse. Now, what happens when you study a Chabad discourse is that in the beginning, there are more questions than answers. And sometimes the questions become so difficult that you say, well, what's going on over here? And then all of a sudden, you see the answer. So we're going to do this. We're going to start a question which is called the Great Paradox. And this Great Paradox, by the way, is so serious that all other religions are based on trying to solve this paradox. And we're going to first try to understand the paradox, and then try to look at the way Judaism answers this paradox. So what's the paradox? So we're going to start from any angle. So we're going to start from an angle from the Talmud, text number 6. The Talmud makes a statement: God fills the world like the soul fills the body. So on the surface, this is a very powerful statement. Why is this a powerful statement? Because a powerful statement is that God is not detached from the world. It's not that God created the world and then he walked away and said, you're on your own. God is involved in every aspect of the world and empowers it, just like the soul is in the body. How do we know? Because as soon as the soul departs from the body, what happens to the body? It's no longer alive. The sign of life is that the life is a sign that the soul is engaged. So number one, what this statement means is that God is intimately engaged with every aspect of the creation, just like the soul is engaged with every part of your body. You can't say the soul is more in the mind and more in the heart and less in your toe. It's everywhere equal. It encompasses your entire body. Secondly, is another thing. The soul, when it's in the body, has to express itself through the body. So when the soul wants to communicate with another soul, how do they do so? Through words, through actions, through vision. So the soul, even though it's in the body, but the body is an instrument and a tool through which it is able to connect. So the world is a way through which God is able to reveal himself into the world. So when you see beautiful nature, what do you say? You don't just say Mother Nature. You say, look how great God is that he created this beautiful nature and how he expresses the sequence of nature in such a wonderful way. So God is communicating to us through nature. Okay, that's what it means. Very good. So where's the paradox? Paradox is that we find in Deuteronomy a statement that Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to the Jewish people before they entered to Israel. And he warns them in the most strongest possible terms against attributing any kind of physical properties or any properties for God. What does it say? The warning. Text 7, page 251. Guard your souls exceedingly. It's not just guard your souls, but exceedingly, as you have not seen any form on that day that God spoke to you at Horeb, which Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, from within the fire, lest you be corrupted and make for yourself a graven image, the form of any symbol, and be led astray to bow down and worship it. Now, this is a very powerful statement, because the powerful statement over here is, it's not just about making an image of wood or gold, but even an image in your mind. If you create an image in your mind and you say, this is what I think God is. God is a male, a female, a man with a long white beard, or a woman with big muscles, whatever your imagination is, that is a form of idol worship. If God is interpreted to my mind, this is the way I view God, that's already idol worship. And that's prohibited in Judaism. We'll soon see why. Let's see how Maimonides translates this. As you know, there are 13 principles of faith that the Rambam writes in the introduction to Mishnah. And he says that all of these 13 principles are the very foundation of Judaism. And if one doesn't have if someone deletes one of these principles, they don't have the faith of Judaism in them. So what are the 13 principles? So he says the one that we need to know for us is number 3, text 8. The third principle is the negation of any physical qualities in regard to God, meaning we believe that the one God is neither a physical entity nor a physical force, nor is he subject to any physical state. Okay. It's interesting that the most famous prayer, which we are obligated to recite twice a day, is the verse Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. What does it mean, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? God, hear, O Israel, God our Lord is one God. Does that mean to say that there is only one God and there are no other gods? Absolutely not. Because that's already a given. That's a given from the Ten Commandments, where God says, I'm God, your Lord, you shall have no other gods before me. So why do we declare that God is one? So when we declare God as one, we mean to say that God is a different kind of existence. God is absolute singularity. All other existence are composite existence. What is a composite existence? A composite existence means it's composed of many pieces. God's oneness is that it's truly one. It's a singular entity. There are no parts. So therefore, we can't quantify God, and we can't say God has a shape, God has a form. We can't say anything to God. Not only that, in Isaiah, as we give a look in text number 9, says the Holy One, to what can you liken me that I should be compared? So in Judaism, the idea of having an image, not a false image, but any image of God is already considered to be idol worship. Because, why is that? Because the moment you picture God the way it's perceived in your mind, so then it's your creation. And then your God can tell you whatever you want to hear from this God. And therefore, you're not truly devoted to God. And what do we know? That if we don't have the submission to the real God, then people can make up their own laws. If you give a look at societies throughout history, no one thought that they were truly evil. You know the famous story with Abraham, that when he was coming with Sarah to Egypt, so he said, I know that God is going to protect you, so don't identify yourself as my wife. Why not? Because the Egyptians believe that adultery is a cardinal sin. That adultery is a cardinal sin. So if somebody wanted to have an affair with a woman that he found, I want to be with this woman, and he finds out that this woman is married, what does he do? He's not allowed to commit adultery. What? Kills the husband. Because murder is just a way of life, or death. But the point of the matter is that they had their own value system. In our world, it's just the opposite. In our value system, murder is terrible. It's capital crime. Adultery is a personal choice. Because when you create your own God and you create your own set of values, then it becomes a corrupt world. The only way to have a world that is truly moral, which is the morality that God instilled, is when you accept God just the way God is, not the way we create a God in our image. So for that reason, in Judaism, Judaism considers the idea of an image of God and as idol worship, which is one of the worst sins. So where's the paradox? The truth, let's talk about two truths. You ever hear that there are two truths and the two truths cannot coexist? This is one of those examples. You have two truths and you can't exist. One truth is that God is undefinable. God cannot be defined. But on the other hand, we say that God is intimately involved in the creation. And not only do we say that God is intimately involved in the creation, we describe God in human terms. We speak about the hand of God, the eyes of God. Not only that, if you give a look at text 10, when we talk about the divine qualities, we say a compassionate and gracious God. Compassionate, that's a human term. We're compassionate to someone else. We're applying it to God. Gracious God, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness and truth. We also say, unto you, God, is greatness and power and beauty. Beauty is a subjective term in human eyes. And triumph and splendor. Unto you, God, is kingship. So here's the great paradox. If God is undefined, and God is not limited, and God is not defined by the world, how does God fit into this world? And how do we say that God acts through the world and is confined to the world by the kindness of the world, the graciousness of the world, the pity of the world. In other words, the paradox here is that if God is truly infinite, how can he relate to the finite? This is the paradox. And not only is God not infinite, but God is even beyond infinity. By the way, a halacha that I want to share with you. The Gemara Talmud says that if someone starts the Amidah and starts to deviate from the text that's in the Siddur and starts to give their own praise to God and defines God in the greatest terms that they think is fantastic, you have to quiet them down. Why do you have to quiet them down? Because who are you to give any kind of adulation to God? Who are you to say what God is and what God is not? So when we say these terms that we just mentioned, these are terms that we find in the liturgy of Moshe Rabbeinu or other prophets. So they said it with prophecy, we can accept it. So this is a paradox, and this is a paradox that we try to resolve. So some religions have come up with an interesting answer. What was the answer that some religions came up? Basically, it's idol worship. They created a mediator. The mediator is something that's in between the infinite God that is able to connect with us. Some idols were actually clay. So they said God is so great that he can manifest himself in clay or gold and wood. And some have it in other human beings. But for Judaism, it's all considered to be idol worship. So how do we reconcile this great paradox? So in order to do that, this is the question that's going to lead to the answer of understanding that text that we read from the Zohar. So please give a look on page 253. And here's an interesting statement. The interesting statement is taken out of Psalms, where it says, with the one who implants the ear, not hear. With the one who forms the eyes, not see. So in order to understand this, I need you to relax a second and please listen to me. Because this, I'm going to give it to you orally before we go in and see what it says inside, okay? When we talk about the creation, the true definition of creation, what is the true definition of creation? Not making something, but creating something. What is creation? Creatio ex nihilo. It's a Latin statement, a Latin phrase, which means making something out of nothing. Not that there's raw material that you change it and you develop it, but it is absolutely nothing there. And from the nothing, something happens, which that's the definition of creation, which only God can do. But in creation, there could be an internal creation and there could be an external creation. So I want to talk about that for a moment. Take, for instance, an artist, or a architect, or a craftsperson that is very good in crafting something. So if you're going to decide to draw what a building is going to look like or a house is going to look like, and you don't want to copy, you want to be an original, what do? The first thing you have to do is create the image in your mind, right? You have to create the image in your mind. And when you create the image in your mind, then you can put it on paper as well. But if you don't create it in your mind, then it can't be projected on paper and then it cannot be built. When we talk about creation, if you take a blank canvas and there's nothing there, and you have an artist that only has paint, nothing happens to it, right? When we speak about God, God is not a blank canvas. God is totally undefinable. When God exists and the world doesn't exist, the items that are in the world don't exist. So take, for instance, love. Love doesn't exist. How did love come about? God created love. But if God wouldn't have created love, love wouldn't have been there, right? Compassion. Compassion didn't exist until God decided that he wants to create it. But once he created internally within himself, and then he was able to project it onto the world or onto humanity. Okay, you understand that? Same thing was with kingship. There was no such thing as a king in the world. Who created kingship? God created kingship because there was nothing in existence. So God went ahead and created kingship. So we have to remember that before time existed and before space existed, the only existence was the existence of God. So when the God exists alone, there are none of these attributes that exist. So in order for these attributes to exist, God has to create them and bring them about. Whether the creation is called that they flow from his emanation or that he creates them, but he creates them. Once he creates them, he can project them onto the world. Give you, for instance, water. Water flows from above to below. What's the origin of water spiritually? According to Kabbalah, it's from kindness, because kindness is all about something that flows from one to the other. So that's where water comes from. The source of water is chesed. Fire rises from below to above, which is strength. That comes from the strength of God. So when God created kindness in the world, everything that is in the league of kindness emanated from that and was created from that, including water and all kinds of kindness. When strength was created, so was fire. These items that were created are summarized in 10 faculties, which we refer to as the 10 sfirot. So the 10 sfirot are not add-ons to God. There's something that God created internally within himself, and through that, he projected it on the world. So everything that's created in the world has to come and relate to one of these faculties. 3 of them are intellectual. So all intelligence that's in the world came from those faculties. There's only one big difference, and that is the human being. The human being is the only one that has all the 10 sfirot. So Kabbalah comes along and reveals the concept of the 10 sfirot model, which is a basis in Kabbalah, in order to explain the paradox of God's involvement in our existence. What does this mean? It means to say that this infinite God created within himself these kind of details. So it's not an image of God. God is still not defined by kindness. God is not defined by intelligence. God is not defined by compassion. But God contains all of that because he chose to create it within himself. And when God shows kindness, he activates that faculty through which he actually does the kindness. So when you say that God is kind and he's actively involved in the world, it's not like he is confined now and he's no longer infinite, but because of his infinity, he's able to create all these items through which he expresses himself. Now, there is the distinction of the human being, because when you look at the 10 sfirot, each of the sfirah defines a particular faculty and a particular characteristic. As I said before, water is kindness, fire is strength, wisdom is chachma, understanding is bina, and so on and so forth. But when he created the human being was different. Let us see why. And this is what's going to answer a famous question. Give a look at text 12. This is one of those statements that the Christians use all the time, but it's misused because Judaism predated it, and Judaism explains exactly what it means. In Genesis, when it speaks about the creation of the human being, so it says, God said, let us make a human being in our image and after our likeness. God is the greatest singularity, and here God is speaking in pluralistic terms. How is that? The same thing is true about the human being. And God had created the human being in his image, in the divine image, he created him. And then the verse continues in one sentence and says, male and female, he created them. The him suddenly becomes a them. There are a lot of mysteries contained in this text. The first question is, what is the us? The Midrash says the us is the angels. Others say it's the future souls. Rav Asadia Goin says that God was being humble, therefore he says we. You know, you can tell when a president is humble or if a president is pompous. The same thing is true with a prime minister or anyone. When they say, I introduced this and I did this and I that, that's the ego. But when he says we and our administration, even though he's the one that did it, but it's a sign of humility, right? So some say that God was being humble. But according to Kabbalah, absolutely that's not what's true. What's true is that there is the singularity, but there's also the plurality in God himself, which he created. And this goes back to what we said before about the two types of creation. There's the external creation, and then there's the internal, but the internal comes first. And we have to talk about internal and external, because when you're talking about human creation, when a human being creates, so even when we create something internal and we have an idea, but still when we craft it, the idea came from somewhere. It didn't just come out of the air. So we're just the one that conveys it. When it comes to God, the internal creation is something which is totally creatio ex nihilo. The light that emanates from God is also creatio ex nihilo to a certain level, even though it's not as coarse as the physical world. That's why it's called emanation, but it's still a creation. Okay? So God creates within himself. Okay. So when God created the world, it's very interesting. When God created the world, he could have created the world just by snapping his finger or saying a word, but he decided not to. He wanted to go do it in an order so that it should be able to relate to us, that we should be able to have an understanding. So therefore, God first created the vision. The vision was when his desire, in the beginning of his desire, when he had a desire to create the world, he had this desire to see what the world will be and to emanate the light into the world. And the light should be projected through these 10 sfirot. But we still have a little bit of a problem understanding these 10 sfirot and why doesn't this give plurality to God? So we're going to see that soon. But first, if you look at page 255, you will see the figure and the drawing of the 10 sfirot. You'll give a look on the right side. There's the Chokhmah, which is wisdom. The left side is understanding. The middle side is Dat. On top of that is Keter, which is desire. Then you have benevolence on the right side, and the left side is strength. It goes through all the 10 sfirot. Okay? Now, these 10 sfirot, as it says in the slide, God imparted these traits to himself. But to think that this is an add-on to God is wrong. And how do we know that? So give a look. Text 13. It's a little philosophical, but it's good. We already studied a bit of Rabbeinu Bechaya, so we'll mention him in another way. The verse contained, text 13 on page 256. This verse contains a very deep idea. Which verse? The verse about let us create man in our image, which is sealed away in the treasure houses of the Kabbalists who seek out God. It holds the secret of the structure of the 10 sfirot, which the human being incorporates in themselves and for which the human form is an analog. God therefore says in our image, meaning in the image we made for ourselves. Okay. So when God says, let's create the world or let's make the human being, he says, I want to create the image within myself. When I create the image of myself, then I can create the world. And the human being is unique, as we see in text 14. Let us make the human being in our image, after our likeness. Each sphere imparted its portion to the human being, internally and externally. Had even one of the 10 sfirot not imparted its portion, the structure of the human being would have been incomplete. Which means the following, that even though many items in the world are made of one or two sfirot, the only entity in the world that's made up of all the 10 sfirot is the human being. And the human being, for that reason, is created in that image. If you give a look at the figure of the 10 sfirot on page 255, it actually is a human being. You have the 3 columns, which is the right side, which is the right hand and the right leg, and the right side of the body. You have the left side. The Keter is the crown, which is on top of the head. You have the intellectual, you have the emotional, and then you have the functional, which is Yesod, which is foundation. And then you have Malchut, which those are functional parts of the body. So that's what it means that we were created in the image of God, that we were created in that image that God imparted within himself through which he wanted to create the world. Which means to say that when it's, because next time somebody asks you this question, and I don't know how many philosophers you will engage. I had a funny story. I used to do chaplaincy in federal prison in West Virginia. Nobody else wanted to do it. So I used to go to Beckley, which was with a place housed a men's prison. And then after being there for 2-3 hours, I would have to go to a town called Alderson that has a women's prison. And I used to have about an hour and a half between the two, sometimes 2 hours. And the trip was only 45 minutes. So what I used to do is pull off in a state park, really go out of the car, walk in the middle of the woods, finish my studies, daven mincha, and walk around, look at the watch. So I should come in time to the next prison. And one time when I was walking, a helmeted, bearded guy with a small beard was spiking fast towards me. He was middle-aged. And when he sees me, he screeches to a halt. And he says, never in my wildest dreams did I think that riding in the woods of West Virginia will I meet a Jewish rabbi, and a Hasidic rabbi for that matter. And he said, I'm a professor of theology. I teach in one of the universities in West Virginia. And I have a question that has been bothering me on theology, and perhaps Judaism can answer it. And he asked me, how much time do you have? I said, I have 30 minutes. He said, that'll be great. And we got into this theological discussion, and it was a very lively discussion. So I don't know how many of you will actually encounter a philosopher, but if you count a philosopher, they might ask you the question. The question is, on the one hand, it says, let us create man in our image. And then again, in another place, it says, God creates the human in my image. What does it mean, God creates the human in my image? If we say that God has no image, so what does it mean that God creates me in my image? And people struggle with that. But now you have the answer. God doesn't have an image. God is beyond an image. But God imparted with himself the 10 sfirot through which he can create the world, and that is the image with which he created the human being. Powerful. You have it? It's not difficult, it's not complex. Again, text 15 on page 258. He says, in truth, in regard to our creator, the infinite creator of all, we cannot speak or describe or require neither judgment nor compassion, neither anger nor wrath, neither variation nor limitation, nor any properties whatsoever. Not before the emanation of the 10 sfirot, nor now after they were emanated. In other words, whether it's before the 10 sfirot or after the 10 sfirot, God remains not only infinite, but beyond definition, beyond description. What we should know, however, is that at the very beginning, God emanated 10 sfirot, and we can provide a nice analogy to make the matter understood by the mind of the wise thinker, of somebody that can really think deeply. The analogy is of water that is distributed amongst various vessels. These vessels are of different colors. One is white, another is red, another is green, and so on with the rest of them. Now, when the water is channeled in these vessels, although the water itself is colorless, it will be seen in the colors of the respective vessels and appear to have changed its vessel's colors, to its vessel's colors. In truth, however, the water did not acquire any new color. The variously colored vessels have imposed their colors on the water, but this imposition is only in relation to how the water appears to those who see it, not in relation to the water itself. So it is with the sfirot. The vessels in the analogy are divine attributes that we call loving kindness, power, beauty, and so on. Each is colored in accordance with its function. White, which he explains later, white is kindness, red is power or strength, and green is beauty. The light of the emanator, which is the essence of these 10 divine energies that flow in the 10 sfirot, are like the colorless waters, as they transcend all the variation and functions. In other words, God remains pure beyond any definition. So the fact that the divine light that emanates from God seems to crystallize in some sort of form, it's not the essence of God that is formulated, it's the divine light that looks that way because it goes through these vessels. The variation and the effect on the world is only due to the differences and functions of their vessel. So how does this explain the great paradox? It explains that the essence of God is still pure. The image is only the perception according to the 10 sefirot that God created. Now, this is the first example that we find in Kabbalah explaining what the 10 sefirot are. And for many years, that's what people had. But it is not a satisfactory explanation. Why is it not a satisfactory explanation? Because when we're talking about God being engaged in the world, it doesn't mean that he remains aloof and he's just pretending. God is truly engaged in the world. And when God is truly engaged in the world, it means that he becomes like the world. So how does this happen? So for that reason, the Arizal, who came after the Rav Moshe Cordovero, after the Pardes, says that there is a part that he didn't reveal that I will reveal, but it's actually contained in his teachings as well. And the Arizal actually explains it, but he doesn't write it. Many, many years later, Rabbi Dov Bereth Mezrich, who was the second leader of Hasidism, writes about this. Let's give a look in text 16, page 260. So he says, all the worlds cannot apprehend God's greatness and power. God therefore performed many contractions. Contractions is called tzimtzum. The tzimtzum was introduced by the Arizal. And what is the tzimtzum? And he says, through this tzimtzum, through these contractions, it enables the worlds to relate with him. So he gives an example to the tzimtzum. If it's too philosophical, I apologize. But I think if we apply ourselves to it, we can understand it in a very simple way. And this is the story when a parent plays with a child. This is like the parent who sees his child playing a game, and out of his love for his child, the father plays along with the child. Although for the father, this is childish and petty activity, nevertheless, out of his love for his child, and in order to derive pleasure from the child, the father contracts his adult mind and inserts himself in the childish mentality so that the child can relate to him. On the other hand, if the father were to conduct himself in accordance with his own mentality, the child would not be able to relate to the father, and the father would not derive pleasure from the child. So let's talk about this for a moment. Every time an adult, this is true with grandparents even more than with children, see a grandchild, those that don't have grandchildren yet, when you have grandchildren, you will be able to understand it. But it's even with parents, but grandchildren even more. You see a grandchild, so what happens? There's an instant relationship between you and the grandchild. The grandchild smiles to you, smile to the grandchild, and you start relating to them at their level. Not to talk their language, but you start relating to them at their level. And at that point, your persona contracts into the child's level so that they can connect with you. But it's not that you're playing a game and you're pretending, because the child will pick up immediately that you're pretending. The child is very intuitive, and the child knows when you're pretending and you're real. But when you're real with that child, with the 2-year-old and 3-year-old, and you truly engage with them, they feel the relationship. But let's think about this for a moment. Does it mean that you're no longer an adult? You're still an adult, because a moment later, or even during that time, you can even think about a deep philosophy. But you have the ability to set aside your adult persona and insert yourself into the child. But it doesn't say that you're no longer an adult. It doesn't mean that you're no longer wise. That's the concept of tzimtzum. So when God created or emanated these 10 sefirot, it was as if he contracted himself, or contracted his energy, not himself, into this dimension of the 10 sefirot, so that he should be able to relate through them. So now we can understand what it means. Now, tzimtzum, by the way, if I can explain tzimtzum, if you analyze the function of tzimtzum, it could be misunderstood, because contraction and condensing is, let's say, a friend of yours or a spouse of yours went and had a great experience somewhere. They went to an art show, or they went to a Broadway play, or whatever it was. And they come home and you say, okay, I couldn't go. Can you describe what you saw? And they say, yeah. And they spend 30 seconds describing what they saw. How do you take that? honestly, you take it that they're not interested in communicating to you. They're just doing it out of obligation because they're not really interested in sharing everything. Had they been interested in sharing what they experienced, they would have been animated. They would have painted the picture for you. They would have given you the glorious colors and the songs and everything that happened on stage to make you feel as if you were there. So what did they do? They contracted everything. They contracted it so that you shouldn't benefit from it. So in that case, Tzimtzum is a negative. But let's say a great professor comes to your home and has just given a lecture to his peers or to her peers, and they sit down and you're having dinner and you say, can you give me the lecture? Now, you're not at the level of that erudition, or you've never gone to that level of schooling that you can understand what they're doing. So if they're going to give you the lecture at the same level that they gave at the university, they're going to do you a disfavor because you're not going to understand anything. But if they condense it to the point that they can relate to you the deep, esoteric or abstract concepts that you should be able to understand it, is that tzimtzum a negative or is it a positive? It's a positive. So tzimtzum can be in either way, okay? So the point over here with the tzimtzum is that it is a darkness because it is contracting, but the question is the tzimtzum for the purpose of revelation, or is the tzimtzum for the purpose of concealment? And we have to always remember, and Chassidus talks about it, is the tzimtzum for revelation, or is the tzimtzum for concealment? If the tzimtzum is for concealment, then it's a negative. Then it's the person basically saying, I don't care about you, I'm just going to do what I have to do perfunctorily because I owe it to you, but I really don't have the joy of speaking to you, and I don't really feel that it's worth my time to spend it with you to explain it to you. But if the tzimtzum is for the purpose of revelation, then it's a whole different thing, then it's a communication. So with Hashem, with God, even though there is a tzimtzum, which is a darkness, but it's for the purpose of revelation. Because God wanted to create the lowest worlds, and in this lowest worlds, he wanted to insert the divine. Now, let's revisit the text that we read in the Zohar. I don't know who made the mark, but I apologize. Somebody put it up there. I don't know if you can erase it. But here's what it says. Let's read it slowly. It's on the board. The reason it's on the board, and I'm not saying to read in the book, is because we're going to highlight something. In the beginning of the manifestation of the king's will, which means king is Hashem, is God, when it first manifests himself that he had a desire to create the world. The lamp of darkness, what's the lamp of darkness? That's the tzimtzum. That's why it's called the lamp of darkness. It's a lamp that illuminates, but it's dark because it's contracted. Engravings in the supernal purity. The supernal purity is the essence of God that is not defined. Engraving is that it was the 10 sefirot. It emanated from the most concealed of all concealed things, from the secret of endlessness. That's where the 10 sefirot came from. A formless vapor was inserted in a circle. Okay, I'm not gonna, the circle is talking about the infinite light of God that emanated from God, and God created it as a circle to create the void in order to allow for the creation of the world. But he inserted a formless vapor. What is a formless vapor? Pure light that was neither a white, nor black, nor red, nor green, nor any color at all. But then when he began with his measurements, in other words, when he began the tzimtzum in earnest to reduce it, he created the bright colors to shine forth. What are the bright colors? We said before, white, which is kindness, red, which is gevura, the strength, green, which is compassionate. So those were the bright colors. Those are the sefirot. So the light in its essence is pure, is colorless. But once it enters into the sefirot, it has a brightness from which the center of the lamp, a fountain sprouted, from which the colors drawn down were below paint. In other words, from that came the light, which inserted itself, created the world, and gives life to the world. So now we understand what this statement is saying. It's talking about the tzimtzum. It's talking about how the paradox is answered that the purity of God remains pure, but through the 10 sefirot, he actually created the world. So here you have a sample of Kabbalah, which goes to the very essence of of understanding the relationship between God and the world. So what do we have from here? God is beyond definition, even the way he's with us, just like the adult is still an adult when the adult interacts with the child. However, God decided to have a relationship with us, so therefore he contracted his divine light that he should be able to relate to us and be engaged in us in every level. Okay? And that's why Judaism says that when we pray to God, we're not praying to God's kindness, we're not praying to God's compassion, we're praying to God, but we're asking God to activate the kindness and the compassion. And now we want to see Hasidus, and this is going to be short because it goes straight to the point, and not only that, it actually takes it on a different level, and it's something that you familiarize yourself. Let me give you a little introduction to this. And we explain this. In our life, there's a great paradox. On the one hand, we are drawn by the body and the physical, which is to pursue material gains, and through that we ignore the spiritual yearnings. But then there is also the spiritual desire. And how do people do that? So you have some people that live the life as if there's no tomorrow, the pagan kind of lifestyle. Live today for there's no tomorrow. Eat today, rejoice today, do all the physical activities that you want. That's what's most important. Then you have those people that are spiritualists, and the spiritualists say, don't indulge in the physical because the physical is an obstruction to godliness. The body obstructs the soul. So if you want to feel the soul, deny the body, contain the body, train the body to be totally subordinate to the soul. Now, when you think about these two options, it is true. The second option is true in many religions. Even in Judaism, there were many great scholars that would practice self-denial, go away from civilization, live on very little, and just be immersed in the study of Torah and bonding with God. There were even some that would wear kerchiefs or blindfolds so they shouldn't take in the beauty of the world because it's an obstruction to God. Let's see how Hasidus tackles it. Because the truth is that God wants us both, the spiritual and the material. So this is a very famous verse. We studied it in the earlier lessons when we were learning about the Kal V'chomer, but we're going to see it in a different level now. Text 17. So it says in the book of Exodus, when you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing under its burden and you're inclined to desist from assisting him, assist you most assist with him. You remember that? If you don't, you look up the notes of lesson 1 and you'll see that we learn a Kal V'chomer that not only if it's for the donkey of the enemy that you have to help, how much more so the donkey of your friend. And not only that, you can only assist him with him. You have to assist him many times with him only if he's helping you. But if he sits there with his hands folded, then you don't have to help him. Remember, we learned that in the beginning. Okay. Now let's give a look at the way Hasidus translates it. This is actually written in the Rebbe's book, Hayom Yom, and it's taken from the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Text 18. When you see the chamor, chamor doesn't only mean a donkey, chamor also means materialism. When you contemplate your material self, which is your body, right? And you see that what? That it is your enemy, that the material itself is agnostic to the soul, antagonistic to the soul, which yearns, the soul yearns for godliness and spirituality. The material yearns for physical. You will further see that it is collapsing under its burden. God gave the Torah and its commandments to sanctify our physical existence, but your body regards them as a burden, and it is loath to fulfill them. Your inclination, therefore, may be that you're inclined to desist from assisting him. You may be inclined to deprive the body in order to break its materialistic nature. This approach, however, is not the way in which the light of Torah will come to dwell in us. Rather, you must assist with him, lift up the body by refining and elevating it. So let's give a look. The original text says, when you see the chamor of your enemy collapsing under its burden, you're inclined and you don't want to assist it, you have to assist it. When you give a look at the Hasidic explanation, as it says in the board, when you contemplate your material self, you will see that it is antagonistic to your soul, which yearns godliness. You will further see that the body regards the Torah as a burden. You may be inclined to deprive your body to break its materialistic nature. This is not the Torah way. Rather, elevate the body by refining it. So what does this mean? Now, of course, in order to be able to come to that kind of level of working with your body, you first have to deprive the body a little bit. You have to practice self-discipline. Everyone recognizes that there has to be self-discipline. And self-discipline means a little bit of self-denial. But on the other hand, it's not about depriving the body, but it's actually recognizing that the body is the tool through which you can fulfill Torah mitzvahs, that the body comes in tune with the godliness. So you have the love for God, you have the love for human beings, your hand is a hand that's doing kindness, your foot is a foot that's running for the mitzvah, and you appreciate it. And for that reason, you come to recognize what the Rambam writes, that having a healthy body is a way of serving God. What does it mean having a healthy body is a way of serving God? That when the body is totally in tune with the soul, and it's totally in harmony with the soul, and they're working together in order to be able to complement each other, then you have health. And today, more and more scientists and philosophers and psychologists and psychiatrists are recognizing that the wholesomeness of a human being, spiritually and physically, gives the best mental life and the best physical life. So the body is totally in tune with the soul. But if the body is going in one direction and the soul is going in another direction and they're enemies to each other, that's an unhealthy life. So here's where Hasidus comes and takes the attitude of the following, because this is the hardest thing. And I want to sort of wrap it all together. And we're finished basically with the class, but I want to wrap it together. Because even those that study Kabbalah have come to the conclusion that ultimately the ultimate good is godliness in the world to come. And they don't have time for the physical world. So they deprive themselves, even people that study Kabbalah. There was a story with a great sage and pious person that he deprived himself all of his life so that the body should not be an obstruction to his spirituality. So he deprived himself when it came to eating, he deprived himself when it came to physical needs, and he was totally focused on the spirituality. And as a result of that, as he was aging, when I say aging, 60 years old, his body was sick and decrepit, to the point that he had a bunch of maladies, and the doctor said, there's nothing we can do to repair. You have caused so much damage to the body by depriving the body that it never got the nutrients that it needed, and now we can't do anything. So as he was lying on his deathbed, he sighed. And the people that were close to him asked him, why did you sigh? He said, what wouldn't I give to live one more day, to be able to do the mitzvahs of God, to put on tefillin, to be able to keep kosher, to be able to study Torah and do things that God, because this is where the action is, that this is what God created the world. So somebody else said he wouldn't have recognized the beauty without building up the soul. So this was what the philosophy was all these years. So you need a little bit of that, but it has to be with a boundary, because ultimately we can't negate the body. We have to build up the body, that the body should be a healthy body, so it should be a receptacle for the spirituality. So the question is, how can God relate to the physical? If you think about, there's a story that I heard from our Mendel Futafas, that there was one time that there was a plague in Russia and many people were dying. But the Russians were so eager to dispose of the bodies that sometimes they would even take people that were still alive, even though they were sick, and they would put them in the morgue and they would put a tag on them. They had a teacher that they really loved, and they thought that he might not have died. So they wanted to take him out of the morgue and see if they can bring him back to life. So they went to the morgue and they bribed the guard, and sure, they went through the morgue and they found the tag on one of the bodies, on one of the legs of the bodies, and it was the name of their teacher. So they pulled him out and they revived him. He was fully alive. He was sick, but he was alive. So they brought him back to life, and he said that really he died. He felt as if he died because he experienced as if his soul left the body. And when he came back to life, he experienced something that he never experienced before. So they asked him, what did you experience? He said, I experienced as the soul was out of body, and the body was a corpse that was a smelly, rotten, whatever it was. And then I was forced back into it. And he gave a Russian word for it. I think it was called the tribuch or something. And that's how I came back to life. So in other words, one has to recognize that the physical body is the bottom of the totem pole. The physical body is so far away from spirituality. And yet we say that the essence of God is found only in the body. It's found only when you do the physical mitzvah. God doesn't find pleasure amongst the souls or the angels that don't have bodies. He only finds pleasure amongst the souls that are in bodies. So how do you explain that? And that's why you need Chassidus. Because what Chassidus says, it's not just that God is beyond description. When you say God is beyond description, and you say for that reason God is infinite, that already is a description. Because infinity is a defined characteristic. That it is infinite, it is not finite. In truth, God is not defined by infinity as well. So therefore, God can relate to the infinite and the finite exactly the same way. So where does God relate to? Wherever his desire is. What was God's desire? The Medrash says God's desire was this physical world. So therefore, the essence of God is found in this physical world. And that's why we bless each other with long life. It's not that you should be able to have another barbecue steak and another chont and all of that, but it's rather that you should have more opportunity to fulfill the mitzvahs of Hashem.